most people want to belong to their peer group. They want to be the same as everyone else when it comes to opinions. In fact, they judge their own personal sanity by bouncing ideas off their neighbours and friends who will answer back and agree on these same topics in kind. It doesn't matter if the topics or what you're given are facts or utter nonsense, as long as everyone agrees at the same time. You'll say, well, I'm sane, and your friends will all agree because they've had the same information given to them.
But they've been programmed, and I'm sad because I know that it's hard for people like that to take an interest, a serious interest in world affairs, to take a serious interest in what their elected officials are doing. And they're not going to be really inclined to study or discover the deception that's being used against them. And so I'm sad because I see all of that in a flash in my mind as being an indication of how easy it is for the masses to be manipulated.
When radio came along, of course, they used that to the maximum. Sports for the men, soaps basically for the women, and then in came television, as I say, with its alpha state, its hypnotic state. And sure enough, around the 1960s, really, 50s and 60s, it took off. It really, really took off. And men became glued on Saturday nights to the sports shows. A culture industry, which is called by its own the culture industry. The Soviet Union had a department called the culture industry. Their actors and directors were called the cultural leaders, because they would, like a computer, people are like computers, all you have to do is keep giving them new updates every so often, and you can change an entire country or a nation or a block of nations who are all getting the same upgrades at the same time along certain paths. Today we call it political correctness. If it's on TV and a famous face says something, then it must be true. He doesn't have to show you facts or anything else. You've been brought up with these faces. That's why they keep these guys on television into their 70s and 80s. You've grown up with this father figure who's on television every night at 6 o'clock, in your house, in your room, staring right at you, and he's a father figure. Would he tell you a lie? So you naturally never suspect him. And this same man will lead you through new topics. He'll introduce experts on the topics. They'll have a little summary at the end of every talk, and you are now left with the conclusion that's presented to you. You don't arrive at it. It's given to you and it's good enough for you. We're programmed today perfectly, just like machines.
This is the best day of my life!
We tie this in with the Brzezinski. Brzezinski said in 2 Ages, now this guy was way up with the NSA. He's a master geopolitician. He admits he works in 20, 50-year periods to do with geopolitics in other countries. But he said himself, the public will shortly be unable to think or reason for themselves. It was meaning by that the form of information that was given to them, the type, the formulas that were in use then in the 1970s. He says, eventually they'll be unable to think or reason for themselves. And eventually, he said, they will expect the media to do all their thinking and reasoning for them.
Thinking is the hardest work there is, which is probably the reason why so few engage in it. Henry Ford. One of the greatest challenges to becoming totally free is to be able to think independently from everyone else. You know instinctively no one cares about you as much as you care about yourself. Yet we constantly listen to others about what is best for us instead of thinking about what is best for us. That is because we live in a world where everybody tells you what to think, but no one tells you how to think. We are blasted every day with advertising, financial sales pitches.
Sometimes you wish people didn't agree with you all the time. At MF Global, we tell you what's good for you.
Political media propaganda, religious dictates, and more social pressure to conform. Most of our lives, we do not make any real decisions. We just kind of fall into a routine. You see, when you really don't think, you leave your mind open to people who do think. The real and most often unnoticed danger is a class of predators manipulating societies for their own selfish benefits. If you go along to get along and not think outside of the box, you risk being caught in the undertow of a doomed society or worse. There is a lot of money and power derived off of having a sucker born every day. Our elite molds societies by educating people just enough to run the machine, but never enough to ask if this is the best machine for us. The elite system wants utterly dependent people to control for power and profit. They do not want fully aware people who can see through the mainstream media lies, the Wall Street Ponzi schemes, or federal abuses. They certainly do not want people educating others to our common plight of this illusion. If you ever wonder why Americans are broke, depressed, and lifeless, look no further than whose thoughts they are thinking. If they are listening to the elite's financial conmen, they are constantly stripped of their wealth through a myriad of schemes. If they're listening to the elite's mainstream media, they're depressed about the national problems because they're too big and the experts say that there's no hope, or worse, hope is coming someday. If they're listening to the elite's medical community, they're hooked on psychotropic drugs. They will never get their fire back by tackling their life's challenges. The elite give us the illusion of freedom, but control all of the choices. The elite give us the choice of 500 cable stations, and yet the same message comes from every one of those channels. They give us aisles and aisles of food, and yet 90% of it is just corn and soy byproducts. They give us a choice of hundreds of political candidates. They give you the choice of investment of stocks, bonds, and real estate. But when this all goes down, you will see that it's all part of the same illusion of the dollar. This paradigm is controlled by the elite. And if you don't think independently for yourselves, you cannot help but to be controlled, whether you know it or not. Every aspect of your life is monitored, regulated, taxed, and controlled, not for your betterment, but for the betterment of others. To do most high-paying jobs requires a certification or a license. That's a form of control. Most assets that you have or own outright are not yours. Try not paying property taxes on a home that you own outright, and I'll show you who the real owner is. All your communications are monitored and recorded. Now the federal government wants these records to be kept indefinitely. Do you think you own your 401k? Try getting your money out. Or how about the stocks that you own outright? The fact is, the DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, owns all of the stocks that are traded. If you want to do anything to your home, you better get permission from the homeowner association or the local zoning board. All these examples, plus many, many more, have nothing to do with making your life better. They exist to create power, profit, and a parasitic life for somebody else. We are fed consumerism, taught that we have no purpose, taught to obey, medicated with alcohol or drugs. Early pregnancy is glorified. Poor diets with fast food. Because of a poor education, people have a lack of vision. We have unhealthy relationships. We're entertained and not really educated. Divorce is a huge setback for many people. With this economy, we're faced with dead-end jobs, an entitlement mentality. We are trained to work for the government. People are saddled with credit card debt, auto debt, mortgage debt, student debt. People are driven to attain worthless diplomas, to become licensed professionals. And once they find some sort of success, they're marked with progressive taxation. They could become a legal target. If they create a business, they're forced to deal with increasing regulations and scrutiny. And then after they're all done, they're faced with the death tax. And regardless of what level of society that you're at, you're faced with federal debt, state debt, local debt, corporate bailouts, weak economy, bank failures, energy dependence, inflation, outsourced jobs, wars, political distractions, illegal immigrants, propaganda, popping of asset bubbles, genetically modified food, cancer, rising health insurance, and most dangerous of all, other ignorant people. At the root of all these traps, there is an elite that has created, perpetuated, and profited off of this reality. And yet, if people were truly to see how the world functions, they would see that the elite are unnecessary, along with their traps. There are 7 billion people in this world. It is crazy to think that less than 10,000 people control this paradigm. Yet this is only possible when the elite convince the 7 billion people that they need the elite and the institutions that they run. Our problems start and stop with us. We are stronger than they are, and they know it. They lack any personal or relationship skills to work with others without the threat of force. Their most powerful weapon is the lie that they convince us to believe. Start seeing the world as it is and think for yourself.
Let me take a step back and a deep breath, because this is a very painful thing to talk about. So all over the world, we know, it's well established, the State Department and intelligence agencies engage in theater, and it's what they do, it's spycraft, to create spectacles and events that people may not realize are spectacles and events, but that, well, like the overthrow of Mossadegh in the 50s in Iran. They'll funnel money to protesters, they'll, fly people in to infiltrate protesters, they'll create fake newspapers, and so on. So we know that this happens in countries around the world. I believe that a law has been passed in the United States, I think it's part of the Defense Authorization Act, I need to confirm this, that, now makes it legal to propagandize American citizens. Do we know about that? Sure. Yeah, it's true. And is it in the NDAA or is it in something else, do we know?
It's a separate bill.
It's a separate bill, and it's been passed, it's now law? Do we know what the 2 years ago. Do we know what the name of it is?
I don't remember, but I reported on it.
Oh, thank you. Will you send me the link?
Yes.
Thank you. So what this means is, and I, as a journalist to say these words, just, I can't tell you with what a heavy heart I say them, but we've entered an era in which it is not crazy to assess news events to see if they're real or not real. And in the United States as well as overseas. And in fact, it's kind of crazy not to. Now, there's so much hype about what I just said, and so I want to be very clear about it so it can't be taken out of context. There's, pardon me, this kind of reflexive vilification of anyone speculating about that because they become a conspiracy theorist, right? Well, just bear with me. I've often thought about this because our intelligence agencies, I respect spies. I mean, who are doing, like before it got out of control, I believe we need intelligence. I believe we need intelligence agencies. I don't think there's anything dishonorable about being in the intelligence services if you obey the Constitution and the law. But all over the world, our intelligence services are engaged in conspiring to create outcomes. That's their job. That's how they're successful. So now that it's illegal to propagandize in the United States, it doesn't surprise me that there's more and more products coming up in popular culture, more and more events in the news stream that seem to be, to my eye, to be subsidized. We know that infiltrators by the police, NYPD, they've been documented, or other police forces, dress up like people they're not and provoke violence. Why is it unthinkable that there might be spectacles that might drive an outcome in the news stream? Let me give you a couple of quick examples. And all I'm saying is we, unfortunately, and I have to say this to my fellow journalists as well, we've entered a time in which we need to be very skeptical about the news stream and look at it critically and ask for more verification and more inquiry. And that's just being good reporters. And it makes it like this, there's spectacle fed into the news media in China. There's spectacle fed into, like Chile. How did Pinochet, engage in his coup? He created photographs of a cache of weapons that the terrorists had, hidden. Was it real? Was it not? Most historians think it wasn't. I mean, this is like not unusual, in the process of creating a closed society. So if laws have made it legal to assassinate American citizens and legal to propagandize them, why should it be crazy or weird to think that that might be for a reason, right? I saw the movie Zero Dark 30, thank you very much. And I have worked on 2 presidential campaigns, so I recognize political talking points. And I wrote a piece saying, this reads like the Pentagon signed off on the script. Because there were like chunks of political talking points identifiable to anyone who's worked in Washington, right? And you don't come up with those if you're a writer writing a screenplay. And everyone was very upset. It was very controversial and scandalous. But in fact, belatedly, a news story came out saying that in fact the Pentagon had, I think, subsidized some of it, but had certainly consulted directly on the script. And I see more and more TV shows about the CIA and more TV shows about spies and gigantic blockbusters in which surveillance is normalized and gigantic blockbusters in which people are tortured to get them to talk in a way that might exonerate people who actually tortured people to get them to talk in Guantanamo. And there's all this money being pumped into these unaccountable, terrorism fighting things. And now there's no law preventing that money from going through front organizations right into popular culture. So that's of interest to me. As I was in CNN once recently, and they were reporting a story about a water skier who had been decapitated on a lake between Mexico and the United States, and it had something to do with a terrorism threat, right? And I was like, decapitated water skier. Sometimes you hear these things and it's like so novelistic. You're like, real life doesn't work that way. Like these are so novelistic. Someone's coming up with it to make it stick in the popular imagination. Or it just makes you think, well, I'd like to document that. I'm a reporter. What's the source? And it kept being just this one guy, Judge Arpajo in Texas. I may be mispronouncing his name. He's a very, yes. He was the source, he was the source, he was the source. And I have this wonderful Facebook community all over the world. And I went on Facebook and I'm like, Mexican Facebook community, is there any reporting about a beheaded water skier in this lake, in this place in Mexico? And they're like, no, what are you talking about? There's nothing like that. Doesn't exist. So I turned to the CNN producer and said, do you have a second source for this story? And it was all over the news, all over the news, all over the news. And they're like, and they checked and it's like, nope, just this guy, Judge, whatever. And I'm like, well, can you find a second source? And they were blushing and embarrassed, and they looked and they confessed that they didn't have a second source, which if you know what journalism is, you're supposed to confirm it with 2 sources.
So who are the big 6 corporations that control nearly everything you see, hear, and read? First, there's Comcast, formerly owned by GE, which controls MSNBC, NBC, and Telemundo. And there's Disney, which owns ABC, the History Channel, and and ESPN. Next, Viacom, the parent company of MTV, Paramount, and BET. And CBS with all its affiliates. And there's News Corp, which owns Fox News, the New York Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And finally, Time Warner, the parent company of CNN, Time, and People magazine, as well as Warner Brothers. So what impact does it have when an agency that's supposed to serve as a watchdog for the powerful becomes a lapdog for the powerful? To break down some of the most egregious cases of censorship and conflicts of interest in the corporate media, BTS producer Manuel Rapalo.
Hi, Abby. How's it going?
Hi, what's going on? So,
Good.
When I think of the top-down censorship, kind of the hand of the corporation blacking out a story, 2 cases come to mind that are the most egregious. The first one was News Corp. Fox News was going to air a story on the bovine growth hormone, BGH, bovine growth hormone. Of course, another Monsanto case of censorship where they were invested in Monsanto for advertising, and their boss said no when a team of Fox investigative reporters wanted to cover this story. Monsanto threatened the station, sent them a letter saying there will be dire consequences. This is a direct quote, dire consequences for Fox News if the story is aired. And I wanted to play what happened when they confronted their boss about this.
I said, you know, this is news. This is important. This is stuff people need to know. And I'll never forget, he didn't pause a beat, and he said, we just paid $3 billion for these television stations. We'll tell you what the news is. The news is what we say it is.
So really, I mean, you know, you look at this case, and it's such an egregious case of censorship, and really he's saying, we'll tell you what the news is. The news is whatever we want it to be. The news is whatever our advertisers want it to be.
No, it's not just, when it comes to the media, really, it's not just the parent companies. It's also your corporate sponsors. It's also the people that are putting out the ads. I mean, Monsanto, had this story actually aired, would have probably pulled their advertisement for Roundup, for aspartame, and all those other products that again aren't tested, but advertise all over Fox News. And it's really interesting that you point out this story, because the reporters and that guy that you just played, they actually countersued against Fox under Florida's whistleblower statute. And as it turns out, under Florida law, they lost that lawsuit because turns out it's not illegal to falsify the news. It's not illegal to falsify the news. So I mean, that really should give you an idea of how dangerous this is and how powerful Monsanto is. Like, they've been doing this for...
Yeah, they've been doing this for the past 10 years. Once again, another labeling issue. We're seeing Monsanto censoring stories. You also were researching a story about ABC.
Sure. This is just another one of those examples. Back in 1998, kind of a very clear-cut example. ABC was 2020, they were going to air this story about how Disneyland is actually hiring pedophiles. I mean, it's just a crazy story. You're thinking a theme park for kids, and pedophiles just sounds terrible. They weren't able to pull the story. Why? Because Disney owns ABC. It's very clear-cut. You don't want to endanger or make the corporate interests look bad. So I mean, that's one of those clear-cut stories, but I mean, it also raises questions. That one's relatively easy, not to downplay pedophiles, but when you look at cases like CNN's running a story about the BP oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon spill, about the cleanup efforts and how, things are getting better, and as soon as the segment's over, you see a commercial come on, and it's BP, and it's BP representatives going, come down to the coast and eat some one-eyed shrimp or whatever they're doing. I mean, there's a problem in there, and it's so obvious, but I think people don't realize it as much as it's in your face.
They don't realize it, but Project Censored, one of the greatest research organizations in the country about censorship in the media, did a study where they found that 118 people only sit on 288 corporate boards that unify kind of this media conglomerate and corporate America. So you have people involved in Kraft Foods, Monsanto, so many different things, defense corporations, the pharmaceutical industry, lobbying together, all sitting on these boards, and it really is such a small amount of people really controlling all these things from the top down.
It's 6
What
corporations.
are some of the most shocking things that you found in terms of just conflicts of interest?
I was looking at this, and when we're looking at conflict of interest, there's two things that really need to be pointed out. It's not just corporations. A lot of execs that sit in corporations and you said it in your introduction, they're sitting on, for example, NBC, Citigroup, Exxon, Philip Morris. Their execs sit on board of directors for Philip Morris. Mm-hmm. That's not okay. CBS has board members sitting in Walmart, General Dynamics. These are drone manufacturers. The execs for CBS are the same guys that are sitting in the board of directors for drone manufacturers. And I think how is that okay?
And I think when people think of the corporate media, they're like, oh, well, of course, the corporate media. But really, we're talking about NPR and PBS as well. I mean, NPR was running a story during the BP oil spill featuring a scientist that was talking about how oil was in the Gulf that would bacteria that would eat the oil. It was like, well, this bacteria is just going to clean up the oil itself. We don't have to worry about anything. Turns out later, according to Greg Palast, the scientist interviewed about the story was given $500 million exactly from BP. NPR never mentioned this detail, this quaint detail, when they were doing the story, and of course we saw PBS.
The thing about that, the money that, I mean, we're talking about one guy that received $500 million. That money, that money actually spread out. It was more like a money spill, is what Greg Palast said in that report that he did. So you've got all these universities, all these independent researchers all over the country doing research on oil biology, and they're all being funded by BP.
And PBS aired the drone drone documentary by Lockheed Martin, pretty much a promo for drones. And, you know, us talking about all this really calls into question. The U.S. State Department issued a warning about restricted press freedom in the rest of the world, meanwhile ignoring that the consolidation of 90% of the U.S. media by 6 corporations. I mean, really, we're ranked 32 in the world in press freedom here.
And exactly, and I know that we had an infographic somewhere. I wonder if we can pull it up. If not, it shows, you know, between 1983 and now, you're gone from this like multitude of media organizations in the country and really narrowing it down to 6. 6 that control nearly everything that we see and watch in this country, everything that we see and watch. And these organizations, they're also making political contributions. So, you know, they're throwing money into both sides of the equation, Democrats and Republicans, and they get back those special connections and inside information, turning you know, talking points into news, essentially.
Indeed they do. Thank you so much. Manuel Rapalo, BTS producer.
Thanks, Abby.